The city was wrapped in the quiet melancholy of September, when summer's brightness began to fade, leaving behind a softness that belonged only to autumn. Trees lined the narrow streets like weary guardians, their leaves trembling between gold and crimson, as if they too were uncertain of the season's turning. The air was filled with a tender chill, the kind that carried both nostalgia and a promise of change. In this city, neither too small to feel forgotten, nor too large to swallow lives whole, there lived a woman who had long ago ceased to expect surprises from fate. Her name was Elena. She was 32 years old, and though her life appeared to others as orderly and steady, within her resided an ache she never spoke aloud. She worked at the old library that stood in the heart of the city, a building with stone columns and high arched windows, with a scent of paper and dust created a refuge from the restless pace of modern life. Every day, she moved quietly through its halls, arranging books, helping visitors, listening to the echo of her own steps in the silence. To those who came, she was always kind, her smile calm, her voice measured. Yet those who looked closely might have noticed a certain distance in her gaze, as if part of her were elsewhere, perhaps in the past, perhaps in dreams never fulfilled. Years earlier, Elena had loved once, fiercely and wholeheartedly, but the man she had entrusted her heart to had chosen another life, one that did not include her. Time had passed, as it always does, dulling the wound, but never erasing it. She learned to live with the absence, to bury her desires under layers of routine, telling herself that love was a chapter she had already read. But every autumn, when the leaves fell like fragments of forgotten promises, a quiet longing stirred within her, reminding her of the warmth she had once known. It was on such an autumn morning that everything began to change. The library doors opened to the crisp air, and among the usual visitors, a few elderly men reading newspapers, students bent over their notes, there appeared a stranger. He was tall, his presence carrying a quiet intensity, though his movements were unhurried, almost hesitant. He seemed older than Elena by a few years, perhaps late 30s, with hair touched faintly by silver near the temples, and eyes that held both strength and gentleness. He walked as though he carried memories that weighed heavy, yet did not break him. The man introduced himself to the library staff only briefly, giving his name, Adrian. He was looking for old journals, archives from decades past, a collection scarcely touched by most visitors. Elena offered to help him, leading him into the quieter, dustier corridors where history slept. She watched him as he leafed carefully through the pages, his fingers moving not hurriedly but reverently, as though the paper itself were sacred. He read for hours, absorbed, yet now and then his gaze would lift and wander the room, and once or twice it met hers. When it did, Elena felt an odd stillness, as though the silence between them carried more meaning than words could ever hold. For days, he returned, always at the same hour, always with the same quiet concentration. Slowly, a rhythm formed. Elena began to anticipate his presence, noticing how his footsteps echoed differently than others, how his manner of asking for assistance was touched with an old-world politeness rarely found anymore. She did not question why he drew her attention so strongly. Perhaps it was the gravity in his expression, perhaps the way he seemed to belong to another time, or perhaps it was simply the inevitability of two lonely souls recognizing each other without speaking it aloud. And yet, Adrian was not without shadows. Elena could sense them, though he revealed nothing. There was something unresolved in him, a past that had shaped him deeply, just as hers had shaped her. In his eyes lay both tenderness and sorrow, as if he too had known what it meant to love and lose. But she did not ask, and he did not tell. Instead, they existed in that fragile balance between strangers and something more, an unspoken thread weaving itself in the silence. As September faded into October, the library became their meeting ground, though neither admitted it. A delicate expectancy grew with each passing day, like the hush before music begins. Elena, who had thought her heart too weary for longing, found herself walking lighter, her world colored with a quiet anticipation she had nearly forgotten could exist. Adrian, though he never lingered longer than his studies required, seemed equally bound to those hours, as if the dusty halls offered him more than just the archives he sought. What neither of them knew was that fate, having kept its distance for so long, was already arranging the first pieces of a story neither expected to live. For both carried wounds, both believed themselves past the season of love. And yet, autumn has its way of gathering what summer leaves behind, binding endings to beginnings in a tapestry of crimson and gold. And so, without realizing it, Elena and Adrian had stepped into the fragile dawn of something new, something that would test their hearts, awaken forgotten dreams, and remind them both that love does not disappear simply because one has ceased to look for it. October deepened, and with it came longer nights and softer afternoons, when sunlight slipped through the library windows like liquid amber. The city seemed quieter during those days, as though it too listened to the hush of falling leaves. For Elena, each morning now carried a quiet sense of anticipation, subtle, almost secret. She told no one of it, for it was a fragile thing, and naming it aloud might shatter its delicate outline. Adrian continued his visits with the same measured regularity, arriving with his quiet step and leaving with little more than a nod of thanks. Yet between those book-lined walls, an invisible thread grew stronger. Elena noticed the smallest things, how his hand lingered over the spines of books, how his eyes softened when he found the page he was searching for, how sometimes he paused as though caught in memory. It was not curiosity alone that bound her attention, it was recognition. She saw in him the reflection of her own silence, her own careful restraint, as if they both carried within them entire worlds of words never spoken. One late afternoon, when most visitors had gone and the library stood hushed in golden twilight, Adrian remained at his table, surrounded by papers. Elena moved through the aisles, tidying the shelves, yet her thoughts drifted toward him. At one moment, when she glanced up, she found his gaze upon her, not hurried, not searching, but steady, as though he were quietly acknowledging what neither dared confess. She lowered her eyes, yet the warmth of that moment lingered long after. Still, Adrian's presence raised questions. What was he searching for among those faded records and forgotten newspapers? Sometimes she caught a flicker of pain in his expression, as if the words on the page carried more weight than knowledge alone. His was not the study of idle interest. It was the pursuit of something personal, something tethered to his own past. Elena did not ask. She respected the silence he guarded, just as she wished hers to be respected. But late at night, when she lay in her quiet apartment with the city breathing softly outside her window, she wondered who he truly was. A man who entered her life so suddenly, as if summoned by the season, could not be merely a passerby. The days folded into weeks, and October's brilliance began to dim into November's quiet. The leaves were nearly gone, leaving the trees bare against a silver sky. One evening, when rain tapped against the tall windows, Adrian lingered longer than usual. The library had emptied, and the world outside had dissolved into mist and drizzle. Elena moved toward him to gently remind that closing hour approached. Yet as she neared, she noticed the expression on his face. He sat with one of the old journals open before him, his hand resting against his forehead, his eyes fixed not on the page, but somewhere far beyond it. His lips pressed tightly together, as though containing words too heavy to release. It was then Elena realized, whatever he sought in those yellowed pages, it was tied to grief. He closed the journal slowly, almost tenderly, and gathered his papers. When he looked up, their eyes met again, and in his gaze there was no pretense, only a quiet weariness, a depth that spoke of wounds not yet healed. Elena said nothing. She only offered him a faint, steady smile, one that carried no demand, no question, and something in that simple gesture seemed to reach him. He inclined his head in silent gratitude, and for a moment it felt as though they stood not as strangers, but as two souls who understood loss, each in their own way. From that evening onward, the air between them changed. Nothing was spoken, yet a closeness grew in the pauses, in the stillness they shared. He began to linger more often, not in words, but in presence. She found herself arranging her tasks so she might pass near his table, and he no longer left the library immediately once his work was finished, sometimes sitting quietly, as though unwilling to break the fragile connection. The outside world carried on, indifferent and busy. But within those walls, something unspoken blossomed, slow, hesitant, like the first green shoots after a long winter. Both Elena and Adrian felt it, though neither dared name it. For love, when it returns after silence, does not arrive with thunder. It comes softly, like autumn rain against old windows, like the whisper of pages turning. And though they had not yet spoken a word beyond courtesy, both knew something within them was stirring awake. Yet beneath that awakening lay shadows, secrets neither had yet revealed. And soon, the time would come when silence would no longer be enough. November slipped quietly into December, and with it came the first snow. The city softened under its white blanket, and the library's tall windows framed a world hushed and bright. Elena found herself watching the flakes drift down during her breaks, each one vanishing against the glass, each one a reminder of how swiftly time moved. Adrian continued his visits, but something in his demeanor had shifted. Though he still immersed himself in the archives, she sensed a growing heaviness in him, as though the closer he drew to whatever truth he sought, the more it burdened him. At times, his gaze grew distant, shadowed by a sorrow he could not disguise. Elena, too, carried within her a storm of thoughts she never voiced. It astonished her how deeply his presence had already woven into her days. She had not chosen it, had not even welcomed it at first, but now, when she unlocked the library doors each morning, part of her waited for the sound of his footsteps. In the quiet evenings when she returned home, she found herself replaying the smallest fragments, the way he turned the fragile pages, the way his brow furrowed when lost in thought, the rare but unmistakable warmth when their eyes met. Yet the silence between them remained. They exchanged greetings, the occasional polite word, but nothing more. Still, within that silence lived an intimacy greater than many spoken conversations. It was as if both feared that words might scatter the delicate bond they had built without meaning to. As winter deepened, the city prepared for holidays. Lights glimmered in shop windows, laughter drifted from crowded cafes, and the streets filled with the hum of celebration. But Elena felt the season differently. To her, the festivities only heightened the sense of solitude she had long carried. Once, years ago, this time of year had been filled with love, gifts chosen with care, evenings spent by the glow of candles, a heart full of expectation. But that belonged to another life, one that had ended before it truly began. Now, she moved quietly through the season, watching from a distance as others embraced joy. Adrian, too, seemed untouched by the festive air. He came to the library as usual, though some days he appeared more weary than before, as if the cold and the memories it stirred weighed heavily upon him. One late evening, just before the holidays, Elena found him sitting long after the other visitors had gone. The library was nearly empty, its vast halls echoing softly with the ticking of the old clock. He had closed the journal he was reading, but instead of leaving, he sat in stillness, his gaze fixed on the falling snow outside. Something in his posture, a quiet resignation, a weariness that seemed almost unbearable, stirred a deep ache in her. For the first time, she wished to reach across the silence, to ask what haunted him, to offer not just her presence but her words. Yet she remained still. The years had taught her the cost of opening a heart too soon, the risk of giving what might not be received. So she only lingered nearby, pretending to arrange a shelf, allowing her presence to say what her lips did not. When Adrian finally rose to leave, he paused. Their eyes met once more, and though neither spoke, Elena felt as though an entire conversation passed between them, one of longing, of recognition, of lives that had known loss yet still yearned for connection. That night, Sleep did not come easily to her. She lay awake, listening to the hush of snow against the window, and wondered whether fate had placed Adrian in her path for a reason, or whether it was merely chance. But deep within, she sensed something stirring, a quiet certainty that this was not a fleeting encounter. And yet, beneath the growing closeness, a truth lingered. Adrian carried a secret. She could feel it in his every silence, see it in the shadows that sometimes darkened his gaze. A secret that kept him apart, that built an invisible wall between them. Soon, that wall would rise higher. For as the year turned, both Elena and Adrian would be forced to confront not only the feelings they had left unspoken, but the past they had tried so carefully to hide. And love, to survive, would demand not silence but courage. The new year arrived quietly, with skies heavy and gray, the kind of days when the sun appeared only briefly, pale and distant. The library reopened after the holidays, its halls colder than before, and Elena returned to her routines. Yet within her, nothing felt quite the same. The presence of Adrian had become part of her world in ways she had never expected, and the thought of him lingered, even when he was not there. When he did return, it was with an intensity that unsettled her. His visits were longer, his search through the archives more focused, as though he were racing against time. He carried folders now, old photographs tucked between pages, fragments of the past he studied with painstaking care. Elena noticed how his hands trembled slightly when he turned certain pages, how his eyes clouded when a memory struck too deep. It was on one such winter afternoon, with snow falling thick outside and the library unusually empty, that she finally glimpsed the truth. Adrian had stepped away briefly, leaving his materials on the table. As she passed by, her eyes fell upon an open page, an old newspaper clipping yellowed with age. She froze. The headline bore the name of a woman, followed by words that spoke of tragedy. There was a photograph, too, a young woman with dark hair and a luminous smile. Elena did not linger, did not read more than a few lines, yet it was enough. She understood then why he came, why he searched. He was not studying history for its own sake. He was chasing a memory, perhaps seeking to piece together something left unfinished, something torn away. When Adrian returned, his expression betrayed nothing, yet Elena saw differently now. She saw the grief beneath his composure, the loss he carried like a hidden scar. He caught her gaze briefly, and though she said nothing, he seemed to sense that she knew. From that day forward, their silence was no longer merely unspoken longing. It was also shared understanding. Two people bound not only by quiet desire, but by the knowledge that both had known love and its absence. Still, a distance remained. Adrian did not speak of his past, and Elena did not press. Yet each evening as she walked home through the snowy streets, she felt a growing ache. It was not enough merely to stand beside him in silence. Her heart, once resigned to solitude, now longed for something more. And though fear held her back, the longing grew stronger with each day. One evening, as winter pressed deeper, Adrian lingered again after closing hours. The library was nearly dark, the tall lamps casting soft pools of light across the reading room. Elena approached, intending to gently remind him it was late. But when he looked up, his expression stopped her. His eyes were shadowed, filled with something unspoken. Grief, yes, but also a quiet tenderness, a plea for connection he could no longer hide. In that moment, Elena realized that whatever secrets lay in his past, whatever losses he carried, they had brought him here to this place, to her. And perhaps, just perhaps, fate had not been cruel, but merciful, offering them both a chance neither expected. Still, fear clung to her heart. To open herself again meant risk, meant the possibility of losing what little peace she had found. Yet as she stood before him, the silence between them filled with the hush of snow outside, she felt something stir, courage, fragile but real. Love does not wait forever. It calls gently at first, then insistently, until one either answers or lets it fade. Elena knew the time was near when she must choose. And Adrian, though he remained silent, seemed to know it too. The winter pressed on, but already, beneath the snow, the first seeds of spring were waiting. And with them, the moment when past and present would collide, when the truth of Adrian's silence and the strength of Elena's longing would either break them apart or bind them forever. February arrived with storms that swept the city in gusts of icy wind, and the library seemed more than ever a refuge, its old walls sheltering warmth and quiet from the restless world outside. Elena had grown accustomed to Adrian's presence. It was no longer unusual, but expected, as natural to her days as the opening of books or the turning of pages. Yet beneath that comfort, tension stirred, like water swelling behind a dam. Adrian had begun to change. He was less guarded now, his silences softer, touched with a kind of quiet resignation. Once or twice Elena even caught the trace of a smile when he noticed her arranging shelves nearby, or when their hands brushed briefly as she passed him a volume. These moments, small and fleeting, carried a weight that startled her. Yet still, the wall between them stood. His past lay unspoken, and her heart remained veiled. The closer they drew, the heavier the silence became, until it felt as though one word might shatter everything. One evening, as the winter dusk thickened and the library prepared to close, Adrian remained seated long after the last visitor had gone. Elena hesitated before approaching, but something in his stillness compelled her forward. He sat with an old photograph before him, his hand resting upon it as if unwilling to let it go. When she reached his table, he lifted his gaze to hers, and in that gaze she saw the truth he had long kept hidden, a grief too deep to disguise, a love lost but not forgotten. He did not speak, yet Elena understood. The woman in the photograph, the one from the newspaper clipping, had been his once. Perhaps wife, perhaps beloved, whatever the bond, it had shaped him irrevocably. He had come here, not for knowledge, but for fragments of her life, for echoes of what he could no longer touch. Elena felt her heart ache with a tenderness she had not known in years. She did not envy the woman whose memory he sought. Instead, she mourned with him, sharing the silent weight of his loss. And in that moment she realized, love is not diminished by grief. It does not vanish with death or distance. It lingers, transforms, and waits to be given again, even when one believes it impossible. She placed her hand gently upon the table, near his, not touching, but close enough to bridge the silence. For a long moment neither moved, neither spoke. Yet something passed between them, an unspoken vow, a recognition that both stood at the threshold of change. When at last he did speak, his voice was low, roughened by years of silence. He spoke not of details, but of truth, that he had loved once, deeply, and had lost. That he had come searching for fragments of that past, not knowing what he hoped to find. That grief had been his companion for so long he no longer knew who he was without it. Elena listened, her heart steady, her gaze unwavering. And when he finished, she did not offer empty comfort, did not tell him time would heal. Instead, she spoke with quiet certainty that though grief may remain, it does not forbid new beginnings. That life, fragile and brief, demands we open our hearts even when fear tells us otherwise. Her words, simple as they were, struck him deeply. She saw it in the way his shoulders eased, the way his eyes softened, as though some weight he had long carried alone had at last been shared. In that quiet room, with snow falling softly outside and shadows lengthening across the shelves, something broke open between them. The silence that had once kept them apart became instead the silence of understanding, of two lives slowly drawing into one. From that night on, the air between them changed. There was still hesitation, still fragility, but also a growing warmth, a promise that could not be ignored. For love, once awakened, does not retreat. It waits, patient and steady, for the moment when both hearts are ready. And soon, very soon, that moment would come. March arrived slowly, as though the city itself had been waiting for the quiet thaw. Snow melted into puddles along cobblestone streets, and the first timid buds of spring pressed against bare branches, brave and delicate. The library, once a sanctuary of shadows and silent longing, now seemed infused with a gentle light, both outside and within. Elena moved through its aisles with a renewed sense of purpose, her heart lighter than it had been for years. Adrian's presence was no longer merely a quiet comfort. It had become a part of her rhythm, like the steady turning of pages or the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. They no longer lingered in tense silence, but shared small exchanges, smiles that spoke volumes, glances that conveyed hope and understanding. Yet what made this season different was courage. Both had faced the weight of the past, the grief and loss that had once seemed insurmountable. Both had confronted the walls they had built around their hearts. And in doing so, they discovered that love is not erased by time, nor diminished by sorrow. It simply waits for the moment when hearts are ready to receive it again. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the arched windows and dust motes danced like tiny stars, Adrian approached Elena's desk. He held in his hand a small journal, worn at the edges. It was the same one he had studied for months, yet now it seemed lighter in his grasp, as though carrying not only memories of what was lost, but also the promise of what could be found. He spoke softly, his voice steady but full of warmth, telling her that the past no longer demanded his solitude, that the weight of memory could coexist with hope, that he had come to understand that life and love moves forward even after heartbreak. Elena listened, her chest filled with a quiet joy she had not dared to imagine. She understood, in that instant, that their meeting had not been coincidence, but a gentle hand of fate, weaving two broken hearts together, showing them that love is resilient, persistent, and endlessly renewing. As spring deepened, the city bloomed around them, and they found themselves walking along streets lined with cherry blossoms, laughter mingling with the soft hum of life. They no longer spoke only in glances, though words were still few. For them, presence had become language enough. Each step together, each quiet moment shared, carried a depth that could not be hurried or forced. And in the quiet of the library, among the soft rustle of pages and the warm glow of the afternoon sun, Adrian and Elena discovered that love, once awakened, does not falter. It grows, it heals, it transforms. It reminds the heart that joy and sorrow, loss and hope can coexist, and that the human spirit is capable of embracing all of it without fear. At last, the season of waiting ended. The walls that once kept them apart crumbled, not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with the gentle persistence of understanding, empathy, and courage. In each other's eyes, they found not only the reflection of what had been lost, but also the promise of all that could still be shared. And so, beneath the budding trees and the golden sunlight of early spring, Elena and Adrian stepped forward together, their hearts no longer burdened by silence. They had discovered the enduring truth that love, patient and resilient, always finds its way back, and when it does, it leaves the soul brighter, the world softer, and the heart open to endless possibility. The city moved on outside, indifferent and busy as ever, but within that quiet sanctuary, two lives had intertwined, carrying forward a story of hope, of healing, and of love reborn, a love that would endure, unshaken by time, loss, or fear. And in the hush of that spring afternoon, with sunlight and the scent of blossoms all around, the world seemed to whisper a simple truth. Love waits for those who are ready, and when it arrives, it awakens everything.